"Just sign it," the husband said. The mistress smiled. "She won't even understand it." The wife looked at the papers, then at both of them. "Maybe," she said softly, "but I know when something is wrong." That was the moment everything began to change. Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe and leave a like. It means everything to us. Please share this video with someone you care about and switch on post notifications so you won't miss any future videos. Also, comment where you're watching from. Thank you for always supporting. Now, relax and let's begin. Ron Howard stood inside a cramped office with cracked walls, staring at a flickering bulb and a desk that looked older than his dreams. The borrowed laptop before him had frozen again, and the unpaid rent notice pinned to the wall felt like a personal insult. He rubbed both hands over his face and muttered, "Maybe this thing is not meant for me." Outside, the evening rain hit the rusted zinc roof in loud, uneven beats. He was tired, ashamed, and angry at himself for daring to dream beyond his condition. The young men he started with had moved on. Ron was still here, almost empty. Stacy Cole met him that same week at a roadside food stall where he sat counting coins before ordering the cheapest meal. She noticed the frustration in his eyes before she noticed the handsome face people usually mentioned. When the seller asked if he wanted extra stew and he quietly said no, Stacy slid her own small plate closer. "Take this one," she said softly. Ron looked embarrassed. "I can't," Stacy smiled. "You can. Hunger should not be proud." Something about the way she said it calmed him. He laughed weakly and accepted. Before they parted, she said, "Don't stop trying yet." Ron never forgot that. Their courtship did not begin with flowers, restaurants, or easy promises. It began with shared bus rides, simple conversations, and long walks home under fatting skis. Stacy listened to Ron talk about warehouses, supplies, contracts, and expansion like they were already real. She did not understand every technical word, but she understood the fire behind them. When he became discouraged, she would say, "Talk again. I like hearing you dream." Ron found peace with her in a way he did not find anywhere else. She never made him feel small for lacking success. Instead, she treated his ambition like a living thing that needed tenderness to survive. They married quietly in a modest church hall with plastic chairs, borrowed decorations, and a small cake that leaned slightly to one side. Some guests whispered that Ron was handsome and promising and could have done better. Stacy heard it all but kept her smile steady. After the ceremony, Ron squeezed her hand and said, "I know what they are saying," Stacy answered. "Then let them talk. We know why we are here." That night in their tiny apartment with poor electricity and second-hand furniture, they prayed together. Ron kissed her forehead and promised, "When I rise, I will never forget who stood with me like this." Stacy believed him completely. Marriage did not soften hardship. It sharpened it. Ron's ideas were strong, but every door he knocked on seemed to close politely in his face. Banks wanted collateral he did not have. Investors wanted pedigree, guarantees, and language he was still learning to master. After one especially brutal rejection, he came home furious, threw his file on the table, and shouted, "They look at me like I'm dirt." Stacy stood still until his breathing calmed. Then she brought him water and said gently, "You are not dirt. You are just early." Ron sat down and cried in quiet shame, and Stacy pretended not to see just enough to protect his pride. Without telling him everything, Stacy began reaching out to her late mother's relatives in the village and nearby towns. These were not polished, wealthy people in boardrooms, but they had influence, memory, and old trust among landholders and traders. Jacob Cole, her maternal uncle, listened carefully as she explained Ron's need. He loved Stacy dearly but said in a firm voice, "Belief is not enough. A hungry man can become dangerous when he tastes power," Stacy answered. "He is not like that." Jacob studied her for a long moment, then agreed to help cautiously. "I will support what protects you too," he said, already planning far beyond what Ron understood. The business finally began to move, though in fragile, uneven steps. Ron handled pitches, proposals, and the public side of the work. Stacy handled the human side nobody wrote reports about. When delivery boys threatened to quit over delayed wages, it was Stacy who sat them down, served tea, and spoke to them with respect until they agreed to stay. When a supplier grew suspicious of Ron's promises, Stacy visited with simple honesty and disarmed him without strategy or polish. She understood something Ron was still learning. People do not always respond to English, titles, or suits. Sometimes they respond to sincerity, humility, and being seen. Ron benefited from her gifts more than he admitted even to himself. He would return from meetings and say proudly, "The supplier relaxed after I explained the projections," ignoring that the man had softened only after Stacy's quiet visit the night before. She never corrected him. It was enough at that stage to see progress. Yet small seeds were already being planted inside Ron. Because Stacy did not speak in business terms, he began classifying her intelligence as instinct rather than value. He appreciated her, but in the way people appreciate steady furniture or reliable light, something useful, always present, and therefore easy to overlook. Stacy, still deeply in love, noticed none of it clearly. By the end of the first difficult year, the company survived a crisis that should have buried it. That alone made Ron stand straighter. He began wearing better shirts, carrying himself with sharper confidence, and speaking with the hard-earned rhythm of a man people were starting to take seriously. At meetings, men who once dismissed him now offered handshakes and longer conversations. Somebody called him visionary in public, and Ron carried the word home like a hidden medal. Stacy celebrated each little victory with wholehearted joy. She cooked his favorite meals, waited up during late nights, and thanked God aloud for every contract, however small. Their living room still looked poor, but hope had become expensive. Yet with respect came a change Stacy could feel but not name. Ron began correcting the way she pronounced words. "Not like that," he would say, sometimes laughing lightly, though the laugh carried a sting. When visitors came, he would add, "Just greet them and leave the rest to me." Stacy obeyed because she thought she was helping. One evening, after she asked a harmless question about one of his files, Ron sighed and said, "Some discussions are too complicated." The words were calm, but they stayed with her long after he slept. She turned in bed and stared at the dark ceiling, telling herself he was only tired. Success opened doors to rooms Stacy had never imagined entering. Ron was invited to networking dinners in hotels with sparkling glass walls, executive lounges, and private events where people wore wealth like perfume. He asked Stacy to join him twice. The first time, she wore her best dress and sat carefully beside him, afraid of making mistakes. The women around her spoke smooth English and laughed with easy confidence. Stacy tried to smile through her discomfort, but she could feel herself being measured. Ron introduced her quickly, too quickly, and moved on. She spent most of the evening alone, holding a glass she barely touched, feeling visible and invisible at once. The second outing hurt more because she noticed what he was doing. He did not insult her openly. That would have been easier to name. Instead, he protected himself from her. He answered for her, shortened conversations, and kept drifting toward groups where she was not included. On the drive home, Stacy asked quietly, "Was I a problem tonight?" Ron kept his eyes on the road. "No, you just don't enjoy these things." She turned to the window and said nothing else. After that, she stopped asking to go. Ron accepted her withdrawal with relief and told himself he was sparing her embarrassment. The truth was harsher. He was sparing himself. Vale came into Ron's professional life during the company's rebranding stage, when appearances suddenly mattered as much as performance. She was beautiful in a polished, deliberate way that made people look twice. Her clothes were expensive without shouting. Her speech was smooth, intelligent, and carefully controlled. She had the sort of confidence Ron admired because it looked like belonging. From their first strategy session, Cindy noticed how eager he was to be taken seriously by sophisticated people. She also noticed his insecurity when personal topics surfaced. "Your wife doesn't come to these functions," she asked one evening. Ron smiled thinly. "She prefers a quieter life." Cindy's eyes brightened knowingly. At first her comment seemed harmless. "You are lucky," she said once. "Quiet women don't stress busy men." Ron laughed, though something uneasy moved inside him. Later, when she learned Stacy had little formal education, Cindy's tone sharpened in subtle ways. "That must be interesting," she said, stretching the word delicately. Another time she joked, "You built all this and still went home to simplicity. That takes discipline." Ron laughed again. He should have stopped her, he knew that. but the strange pleasure of being understood by someone from that polished world weakened his moral footing. Each unchallenged joke made the next one easier. Each silence became a small betrayal. When Ron and Stacy moved into a larger house, neighbors admired them openly. The gates were high, the floors gleamed, and the sitting room carried the kind of silence expensive homes often have. Everyone called it a blessing. Stacy tried to see it that way. She arranged curtains, folded new towels, and placed flowers in corners that still felt cold to her. Ron, meanwhile, became busier than ever. Meetings stretched late into the night. Calls followed him into bed. Some mornings he left before sunrise. Stacy walked through the beautiful rooms like a visitor entrusted with maintenance. The house was too large for one lonely heart. Even her footsteps sounded temporary there. Gina Howard, Ron's younger sister, was the only one who walked into the house and looked beyond its beauty. She noticed how often Stacy sat alone in the afternoon without turning on the television. She noticed untouched meals and half-finished prayers. One day, Gina found Stacy in the kitchen staring at nothing. "Are you okay?" she asked. Stacy turned and smiled too quickly. "I'm fine." Gina stepped closer. "No, you're not." Stacy laughed softly, but her eyes had already become wet. "Marriage has seasons," she said. Gina hugged her without speaking. From that day, Gina began watching Ron with quieter, more troubled attention than before. The first public humiliation came during a company celebration held in a grand hall full of soft music and expensive perfume. Ron had insisted Stacy attend because some senior stakeholders would be present. She agreed, hoping maybe this time things would feel different. For a while she stood quietly beside him, smiling when greeted. Then Cindy approached in a silver dress, elegant and perfectly at ease. She glanced at Stacy, then turned to a group nearby and said with smooth amusement, "Some rooms are so advanced, even silence looks confused." A few people chuckled. Stacy froze. Nobody mentioned her name, but she felt the insult land squarely on her chest like a thrown stone. Ron heard it. Stacy knew he heard it because his jaw tightened for a second. That single second was enough to give her hope. He would say something. He would tell Cindy to stop. Instead, he forced a smile and redirected the conversation toward work. The group moved on. Cindy's eyes flashed with quiet victory. Throughout the rest of the evening, Stacy's hands felt cold. On the drive home, Ron kept talking about the success of the event as though nothing had happened. At last, Stacy asked, "Did you hear what she said?" Ron exhaled sharply. "You are taking things too personally." Something broke inside her then, softly but permanently. After that night, a slow poison entered the marriage and spread through ordinary moments. Ron began treating Stacy's simplicity as a flaw to be managed. "You need to change how you dress," he said one morning, flipping through messages on his phone. "And please, when company people visit, don't ask too many questions." Stacy stood with a tray in her hands and nodded quietly, though the words stung. She began trying to improve herself in small, secret ways, listening harder when people spoke, repeating words alone, watching interviews she barely understood. She did not want sophistication for its own sake. She only wanted the man she loved to stop looking embarrassed by her. Cindy, meanwhile, moved steadily closer. Her admiration for Ron came wrapped in the kind of respect he had always longed for from polished people. She praised his leadership, laughed at his sharper remarks, and made him feel like he belonged among the elite. Where Stacy loved him plainly, Cindy admired him theatrically. Ron began craving the performance. Their emotional affair deepened through long calls and private jokes before either admitted what it was becoming. Stacy sensed the distance widening but could not prove anything yet. Some nights Ron sat beside her on the bed, typing and smiling faintly at messages he turned away from her. Silence began doing the work that lies had not yet completed. One afternoon, while folding Ron's shirts, Stacy found herself remembering the man he used to be. Not the polished executive with measured words and expensive watches, but the restless dreamer who once slept on a thin mattress and woke gasping from fear of failure. She remembered nights when they shared one loaf of bread and called it dinner, laughing so hardship would not hear them. She remembered him sitting on the floor with papers spread everywhere, saying, "If this works, I'll build us peace." Stacy would touch his shoulder and answer, "Then keep going. I am here." Those memories rose now like ghosts, making the silence of their fine bedroom feel crueler. She also remembered the things she had hidden from him to keep hope alive. The mornings she skipped breakfast so he could eat before a meeting, the small lies she told creditors, the prayer she repeated when his shoulders shook with defeat. She had not merely stood beside Ron. She had stood under him like unseen support. Yet here they were, years later, and he now looked at her as though she belonged to a chapter of his life he had outgrown. Stacy sat on the edge of the bed and whispered into the empty room, "What changed you?" No one answered. Only the air conditioner hummed coldly, while memory kept breaking her heart. Arnold Benson returned to Stacy's life by accident, though later she would think of it as mercy. She met him outside an old records office while waiting for Gina, who had stopped nearby for an errand. Arnold had once been a trusted records officer connected to files from Stacy's late mother's family. Age had bent his shoulders but not his eyes. The moment he saw Stacy, his expression softened with recognition and concern. "Child, it has been years," he said. Stacy greeted him respectfully. During their conversation, he noticed the sadness she tried to hide. "You look like someone carrying stones in her chest," he told her quietly. The words startled her. She did not mean to tell him much, but pain can loosen guarded mouths. Stacy mentioned that Ron had recently begun bringing documents home and expecting signatures without explanation. Arnold's face changed at once. "Never sign what you cannot read," he said. Stacy looked down, ashamed. "That is the problem, sir." Arnold paused, then softened. "Not reading well is not the same as being foolish." He told her there were ways to understand what mattered without pretending to know everything. "Bring me one paper someday," he said. "We will start with titles, names, and intentions." Stacy hesitated, then nodded. For the first time in months, she felt a cautious, fragile kind of hope. Their lessons began quietly in Arnold's small sitting room, surrounded by old files, worn books, and the smell of dust and tea. Stacy came under harmless excuses, often saying she was visiting an elderly family acquaintance. Arnold never rushed her or made her feel small. He showed her how to look at a document without fear, how to identify names, dates, clauses, and the difference between ordinary approval and dangerous transfer language. "You do not need big grammar to protect yourself," he said one evening. "You need patience." Stacy repeated unfamiliar words slowly, sometimes stumbling, sometimes laughing shyly at herself. Arnold would only say, again, calmly, "There is no shame here." The weeks passed. Something inside Stacy began to wake. She still did not sound polished, and she still could not read fast, but she was no longer helpless before paper. She learned to recognize asset references, ownership terms, and changes hidden inside formal language. More importantly, she began feeling her mind return to her as a place of strength instead of embarrassment. At home, Ron and Cindy continued moving through life with careless superiority, believing Stacy understood nothing beyond cooking and silence. That contrast gave the story its slow, painful tension. While they laughed at her ignorance, Stacy was quietly gathering the exact tools she would need to survive what they were preparing to do. Cindy became bolder once she sensed Ron would not set boundaries. Her visits to the house grew more frequent under professional excuses. Some evenings she arrived with branded folders and left after dinner. Other times she stayed in the sitting room laughing with Ron over wine, while Stacy stood in the dining area pretending not to hear. Cindy's insults were rarely direct. That made them worse. She praised furniture choices in ways that implied Stacy lacked taste. She spoke warmly about modern partnership as though traditional loyalty were a weakness. Every smile carried a blade. Stacy endured it quietly, but Gina, whenever present, watched with growing disgust. She began realizing the disrespect was no longer accidental or subtle. Ron, instead of noticing the injury he was permitting, became impatient with Stacy's discomfort. One night after Cindy left, Stacy said carefully, "I don't think she respects me." Ron gave a tired laugh. "Not everything is an attack, Stacy. You are too sensitive." She looked at him for a long moment. "Would you say that if someone treated me kindly?" Ron's face hardened. "I am tired of this backward thinking. Learn to adapt." The words sat between them like a slap. From that point, emotional cruelty became ordinary inside the house. Stacy started moving through her own home with the caution of a guest, while Cindy behaved more and more like a woman rehearsing occupancy. During one of her lessons, Arnold pulled out an old chain of papers related to the company's expansion land. He had become curious after seeing names repeated across recent documents Stacy brought. As he adjusted his glasses and followed the asset trail, his expression changed. "No," he murmured. "This cannot be coincidence." Stacy leaned forward, anxiety rising. The file included references to a family holding structure, a protective arrangement, and names tied to her late mother's lineage. Arnold grew still for a long moment, then looked at her carefully. "Has your Uncle Jacob spoken to you about the land the company stands on?" Stacy shook her head. Her heart began beating unevenly. Arnold did not explain everything at once because even he wanted certainty before opening such a wound. But he showed Stacy enough to unsettle her deeply. The most profitable arm of Ron's company appeared linked to a structure that carried her family's legal fingerprints. "This is not ordinary," Arnold said. "Either there was protection placed here for a reason, or someone buried a truth that matters now." Stacy felt dizzy. She had come to learn how not to be deceived, not to uncover something this enormous. "Are you saying my family owns it?" she whispered. Arnold answered honestly, "I am saying your husband may not fully own what he behaves like a king over." By Arnold's findings, Stacy went to see Jacob. Her uncle received her in the old family house with a troubled expression, as though he had known this day might come and dreaded it. She did not waste time. "Uncle, what is tied to my name?" she asked. Jacob's silence lasted too long. Then he sighed deeply and motioned for her to sit. What followed was not one clean explanation but a painful unveiling. Years ago, when Ron's business dream was too fragile for serious financiers, Jacob had used family-backed structures to secure the land necessary for expansion. He did it carefully, protecting the asset from risk, and placed the beneficial ownership under Stacy's name. Stacy stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you do that without telling me?" Jacob's old eyes filled with sorrow. "Because I wanted your marriage to be built on love, not power, and because I did not fully trust a man desperate for success." Stacy's lips trembled. "But I trusted him." Jacob nodded sadly. "I know." He explained that Ron was told only enough to move forward, never enough to tamper with what he did not understand. The protection was meant to remain quiet unless danger arose. Stacy sat in stunned silence as the truth rearranged her whole life. She had carried Ron emotionally, and all along, part of the company's ground rested legally beneath her too. Not long after that revelation, Ron came home behaving with a softness Stacy had not felt in months. He greeted her warmly, asked about her day, and even complimented the meal she served. The kindness frightened her more than his usual irritation. After dinner, he brought out a neat stack of papers and sat beside her. "These are just routine restructuring documents," he said smoothly. "Nothing serious. We only need your signature to tidy some ownership language for the company's next phase." Stacy kept her face still. She could almost hear Arnold's voice in her mind. Ron placed a pen in her hand with practiced ease. "It's simple," he added. Stacy did not sign. She told him she wanted to look through them first. Ron laughed lightly as though amused by a child. "Since when do you read restructuring papers?" he asked. She smiled faintly and said, "Since now." His expression shifted, though only for a second. Later, she took the documents to Arnold, who studied them line by line. The truth was ugly. The papers were designed to weaken the protections tied to her beneficial interest and transfer control more cleanly away from her family-linked position. Stacy sat rigid with horror. This was no longer only emotional betrayal. Ron was not merely ashamed of her. He was trying to erase her from the very structure she had helped uphold. The final piece of Stacy's innocence died 2 nights later. She had gone downstairs for water when voices from the study stopped her on the staircase. The door was partly open. Cindy was inside, laughing softly. "Please tell me she still has no idea," she said. Ron answered with unbearable confidence. "Stacy, she will sign anything if I smile and speak gently. She doesn't understand half the words on those pages." Cindy laughed harder. "Women like her should just be grateful they married into comfort." Ron's reply came low and careless. "Exactly. She has lived above her level long enough." Stacy stood frozen in the dim hallway, every word entering her like broken glass. She did not storm in. She did not cry loudly. She simply went back upstairs with the water untouched in her hand and sat on the bed in darkness until dawn. Something final had shifted. The heartbreak remained, but it was no longer confused. She now saw Ron clearly, not as a tired husband, not as a man temporarily changed by pressure, but as someone willing to humiliate, deceive, and use her because he believed she was too small to resist. When morning came, Stacy moved through the house with unusual calm. Ron kissed her cheek before leaving, and she did not flinch. Quietly, painfully, she had become awake in a way he would soon learn to fear. Gina's turning point came when she visited unexpectedly and found Cindy seated too comfortably in Stacy's sitting room, giving instructions to staff as though she belonged there. The sight disturbed her deeply. Later, she cornered Ron in his office and said, "What exactly are you doing?" Ron frowned. "Working." Gina stepped closer. "Don't insult me. That woman disrespects your wife in your own home and you let it happen." Ron's face hardened with irritation. "You are emotional. You don't understand how things work at this level." Gina stared at him in disbelief. "At what level do decency and loyalty become backward?" Ron looked away, unwilling to answer. That evening Gina found Stacy in the kitchen rinsing cups slowly, almost mechanically. Guilt rose in her chest. "I should have spoken earlier," Gina said, voice shaking. Stacy turned and smiled gently, which only made Gina cry harder. "Please don't defend him to me," Gina whispered. Stacy placed a hand on her arm. "I'm not defending him, I'm just tired." Gina lowered her head. "I thought it was a phase, I kept hoping he would correct himself." Stacy's eyes softened with old grief. "So did I." In that simple exchange, Gina fully chose her side. Stacy's silence was no longer something to misunderstand. It was suffering carried with dignity. The formal request for Stacy's signature came on a Sunday afternoon, staged with calculated politeness. Ron laid the documents neatly on the dining table while Cindy, dressed elegantly as usual, sat nearby pretending casual interest. Stacy looked at the pages, then at Ron. "Can you explain this section?" she asked, pointing carefully. Ron gave a patronizing smile. "It's routine language. You don't need to burden yourself with details." Cindy stirred her tea and added sweetly, "Some documents are wasted on people who don't work in that world." Stacy looked at her for one long second, then back at the papers. "What is a transfer?" she asked. Ron's patience thinned visibly. When Ron realized she was not yielding easily, his tone sharpened. "Why are you suddenly behaving like a lawyer?" Cindy let out a small, amused laugh. "Maybe she thinks signatures are a status symbol." Stacy placed the pen down gently. Then she lifted her head and said in the calmest voice either of them had heard from her in years, "I will not sign." The room changed instantly. Ron stared at her as though he had misheard. Cindy's smile froze. "Excuse me?" Ron asked. Stacy repeated herself without trembling. "I said no." It was not loud, not dramatic, but the refusal crashed through their plans like thunder breaking over a quiet sky. Ron did not react with open rage at first. He tried persuasion. That evening he came to Stacy with softened eyes and a patient voice. "You know I would never harm you," he said, sitting beside her. "This is about protecting the company's future." Stacy kept folding clothes without looking up. "Then the future can wait until I understand it." The next day, persuasion turned to guilt. He spoke of employees, loans, and pressure. "Do you want to be responsible if things go wrong?" he asked. Stacy answered quietly, "I did not create what is wrong." Her calm unsettled him more than tears would have. It suggested thought, not confusion. Cindy, less patient and more arrogant, pushed Ron toward intimidation. Soon his voice grew sharper, his words harsher. "You are suddenly acting above yourself," he snapped one night. "Who has been filling your head with nonsense?" Stacy looked at him steadily and said nothing. That silence infuriated him because he could no longer predict it. Pressure increased from every direction. Staff felt tension in the house. Calls came more frequently. Cindy spoke openly about the risks of delay, calling Stacy ignorant and stubborn. Yet inside the storm, something strong was forming quietly. Stacy still felt hurt, afraid, and lonely, but she no longer panicked when Ron raised his voice. Her center was beginning to hold. The missing signature began producing consequences Ron had not anticipated. Banking processes slowed. Legal teams asked follow-up questions. A planned restructuring that should have moved smoothly became tangled in references Ron himself barely understood. He spent longer hours behind closed doors, taking angry calls and demanding urgent clarifications from advisors. For the first time in years, he was forced to look backward into foundational paperwork he had always treated as minor history. The empire he wore like armor began showing cracks. Stacy noticed the change in his footsteps. He no longer moved through the house with effortless certainty. Frustration had replaced polish, and fear had begun entering places arrogance used to live. Cindy changed too. The elegant composure that once made her seem untouchable began thinning under pressure. Her affection for Ron, so effortless when the company seemed secure, now sounded like strategy coded in panic. "You need to fix this woman issue now," she told him bluntly during one tense meeting Stacy overheard in passing. There was less seduction in her voice now, more desperation. Ron started seeing glimpses of self-interest beneath her admiration, though not yet enough to fully accept what it meant. The affair lost some of its glamour once risk entered the room. It is easy to feel powerful beside a rising man. It is harder when the ground under him begins to slip. The matter moved into formal review faster than Ron expected. Lawyers requested old asset trails, historical approvals, and original land-linked documents connected to the expansion arm of the company. Ron entered the process believing confidence and strong legal representation would still carry the day. Stacy entered differently. Guided by Arnold and supported quietly by Jacob, she did not come as a vengeful wife seeking spectacle. She came as a wounded woman trying to understand truths buried from her for years. The review room itself felt cold and orderly, polished table, files stacked in measured order, voices careful and professional. For the first time, Ron's authority did not automatically dominate the space. That unsettled him. As records resurfaced, dates and signatures began telling a story Ron had never bothered to learn properly. The expansion land was not as cleanly his as he had always assumed. Protective language, family holding structures, and beneficial references pointed back again and again to Stacy's side of the story. A senior legal advisor paused mid-explanation and asked, "Mr. Howard, were you aware of this protective arrangement?" Ron's mouth dried. "Not in this form," he said tightly. Stacy sat across from him, hands clasped, heart pounding but outwardly composed. She was still grieving even there, yet the balance in the room had shifted. For the first time, Ron was the confused one. Cindy's panic fully surfaced once she understood that Stacy's refusal was not stubbornness but leverage grounded in law. "How could you not know?" she demanded when she and Ron were alone after a review session. Her voice, once velvet, had become sharp with accusation. "You built an entire future without checking what sat under it," Ron, already strained, snapped back. "I knew enough to run the company." Cindy gave a humorless laugh. "Clearly not." The cracks between them widened quickly. She had loved the polished version of Ron, the man rising upward, admired and in control. This frightened, uncertain man forced to answer old questions was much less appealing to her ambitions. That chapter revealed something painful and necessary. Cindy had not entered Ron's life during hunger, doubt, or sacrifice. She entered once the gates, glass walls, and titles were already in place. Now that the structure trembled, her devotion thinned alarmingly. Ron began seeing what Stacy had always been and what Cindy had only performed. But realization came too late to save anything meaningful. Stacy, watching from a distance, took no pleasure in their strain. She felt only exhaustion. Even betrayal, when fully exposed, does not always taste like victory. Sometimes it only confirms that what your heart feared for months was true, and that confirmation can ache more deeply than uncertainty ever did. Jacob finally revealed the full truth in a private meeting attended by Stacy and Arnold. He brought old papers, sealed copies, and his own grave conscience. Years ago, when Ron's business was too fragile to be trusted by serious financiers, Jacob had used a family-controlled legal structure to secure the land needed for the company's most profitable expansion. The beneficial ownership was placed in Stacy's name, not to make her rich in secret, but to make sure she would never be left defenseless if the marriage turned cruel. I prayed the protection would never need to speak, Jacob said, voice heavy. I wanted your husband to remain worthy without ever knowing its full weight, listened with tears sliding quietly down her face. The truth did not inflate her. It broke her differently. She had always known she sacrificed emotionally for Ron, but now she understood her family had also supported him materially in ways he never respected enough to understand. So even the ground helped him through me, she whispered. Jacob nodded sadly. Yes. Arnold added, and he treated you like a burden standing in the way. That was what made the revelation so devastating. Ron had not merely overlooked his wife's contribution. He had mocked and tried to erase the very woman whose love, labor, and legal protection had stood beneath his empire from the beginning. The final board and legal session was convened on a gray morning heavy with anticipation. Ron entered wearing one of his finest suits, trying to recover some trace of the authority that had once come naturally to him. Cindy arrived poised but tense, her elegance unable to hide the fear in her eyes. Stacy came simply dressed, without display, accompanied by Jacob and Arnold. She looked calm, though her heart carried years of insult, disappointment, and buried love. When the findings began, the room grew still. Each document laid out the same truth more clearly than the last. The company's most valuable expansion asset could not be separated cleanly from Stacy's protected beneficial interest and family-linked structure. A board member who had once barely greeted Stacy now looked at her with stunned respect. Ron, meanwhile, sat motionless as facts dismantled the false hierarchy he had lived inside. The wife he treated like an illiterate embarrassment was not an irrelevant woman living off his success. She was central to the legal stability of the company itself. That humiliation was worse because it came publicly and precisely. There was no emotional argument he could dismiss, no charm he could use to bend it. Cindy's face drained of color. Even she, who once mocked Stacy's silence, could find nothing to say. Truth had entered the room in documents. And it was heavier than mockery. Everyone expected triumph to shine on Stacy's face after the findings were completed. Instead, sorrow lived there more than victory. She sat quietly, listening as lawyers discussed options, protections, and restructuring paths. Ron looked at her with the stunned expression of a man seeing someone clearly for the first time after years of deliberate blindness. But Stacy did not enjoy that moment. How could she? The man she had once prayed for, defended, and believed in had become the source of her deepest humiliation. Vindication could not restore the years of shame. It could only expose them. Even surrounded by proof, she still looked like a woman mourning something sacred that had died slowly. When one senior official finally asked what outcome she wanted, the room seemed to hold its breath. Stacy rose gently and spoke without performance. "I never asked for power over my husband," she said. "I never wanted secrets to control love. I only wanted to be loved without being shamed." Her voice trembled, but she did not stop. "If I was enough when there was hunger, why did success make me too small?" The room fell silent under the weight of her dignity. Cindy lowered her eyes. Ron could not even look up. Stacy's grief carried more moral force than anger could have. She did not need to humiliate anyone. The truth was already doing it. Ron asked to speak to Stacy privately after the session, and for the first time in years, there was no pride left in his voice. They met in a quiet side room where the walls were bare and the air felt heavier than speech. Ron stood before her stripped of polish, his apology clumsy with fear and late understanding. "I was wrong," he said, voice unsteady. "I became someone I don't even recognize." Stacy looked at him and saw traces of the younger man she had loved buried under ruin. "You recognized yourself enough when you were laughing at me," she replied softly. Ron closed his eyes as if the words themselves burned. He tried again, speaking of pressure, ego, distraction, and the gradual corruption he had ignored. But excuses sounded thin in that room. Stacy listened with tears in her eyes, not because she believed him fully, but because all her love had not vanished cleanly. Pain is often tangled that way. At last she asked the question that had been forming inside her long before the boardroom, long before the documents, long before the public shame. When we had nothing, she said, voice shaking, was I still too small for you? Ron opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no answer strong enough to survive that question. Silence condemned him more deeply than any verdict. Once the legal and internal consequences deepened, Cindy's departure became inevitable. She began distancing herself in careful, selfish steps, avoiding calls, speaking through lawyers, and protecting her own professional reputation wherever she could. The woman who had once laughed beside Ron now treated him like a liability to be managed. Watching her withdraw completed the lesson humiliation had started teaching him. He had traded devotion for glamour, memory for performance, and loyalty for admiration that vanished the moment his power looked unstable. Stacy did not need to point this out. Ron saw it himself in painful detail. The emptiness Cindy left behind only highlighted the depth of what he had thrown away. Gina stayed close to Stacy through the aftermath, helping quietly in practical ways and guarding her from unnecessary stress. Jacob and Arnold worked with the legal teams to stabilize the company without destroying livelihoods, because Stacy refused to punish innocent employees for Ron's sins. That choice revealed her character more than any speech could. Yet even with dignity guiding her, she was emotionally exhausted. Revenge did not taste sweet to her. It tasted like ash after a fire. Ron, meanwhile, still moved through the ruins of his pride, forced to live with the simple, unbearable truth. He had betrayed the one person who had truly been for him when he had nothing. Time did not heal Stacy overnight, but it began teaching her how to stand inside her own worth without apology. She did not become flashy, arrogant, or eager to imitate the polished women who once made her feel small. Instead, she became steadier. She continued learning with Arnold, speaking more confidently in meetings when necessary, and making decisions from a place of calm rather than fear. People around her began seeing what had always been there: intelligence shaped by life, strength shaped by suffering, and dignity that did not need decoration. The house that once made her feel like a ghost no longer held the same power. She moved through life with quieter ownership now. Ron remained part of the company's restructuring process, but not as the untouchable man he once believed himself to be. He had to face damage slowly, professionally, and personally. Stacy did not return to the old marriage, because some betrayals break trust at the root. She chose distance, boundaries, and peace over sentimental repair. In the final scene, she stood outside one of the company buildings at sunset, looking at the land that had silently carried so much of her pain and sacrifice. Gina stood beside her. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Stacy exhaled and said, "Not yet, but I am no longer lost." And that was the beginning of her freedom. We've come to the end of the story. Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Leave a like, share, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification. Thank you so much for watching.